Welcome back to the Forum Book Club. I hope it's welcome back, but for you first-time viewers, welcome as well. We're going to conclude our discussion internally here on this wonderful book, America on Trial in Defense of the Founding, by Robert Reilly. Next week, we'll have the author himself, God willing, with us on the show. So we're at the final lap now of this book, the home stretch. And I think it really kind of comes to a converging point here at the end of these three chapters. Chapter 9, how the foundation of America was a foundation, a restorative founding, not a revolution in the sense of something totally new, but rather restoration of a natural law order based on reason. And then in chapter 10, he shows the very stark opposition between the American Revolution and the French Revolution at about the same time, a decade apart. And then finally, not quite finally, I guess, there's an epilogue, but final chapter, he will respond specifically to the critics that he's been aiming this book at to explain why they got it wrong, why he thinks they got it wrong. And then finally, it's a fascinating epilogue where he says, look, if the foundation was all right, then how come things went so bad? And he blames it on something kind of surprising. When you think about it, it's quite reasonable. So let's move into that. I want to start with a couple of things on page 248, the first page of the chapter. But for the other two chapters, I'm going to rely heavily on Vivian Dudreau and Joseph Pierce. Next week, I think we'll have little labels under us from time to time so people won't forget who we are, unimportant as that is. So on the first page of chapter 9, page 248, he says, second sentence, we have emphasized that liberty and constitutional order are not the products of just any conception of the universe, but of only one, that of Judeo-Christian and natural law tradition. Further, he quotes this historian David Ramsey, in no age before and in no other country did man ever possess an election of the kind of government under which he would choose to live. And then finding the footnote, he says, this quotation provides one of the often overlooked meanings of the frequently misunderstood term American exceptionalism. I must admit, I've kind of, I found that term rebarbative. It's a word I like. It always kind of put me off because why are we so exceptional? You know, every country has its unique characteristics and quality and culture and everything. And so who are we to proclaim that we are somehow really special, as used to tell children in the early grades? But I think he has a point there that it is unusual, if not unique, that people can actually start on a tabula rasa and start a country, start a nation, start a civilization, not a civilization, but a society, without any prior constraints. And so that does make us, I think, kind of exceptional. But Joseph.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, first thing I would like to say is that I hadn't actually read the footnote, but I had actually highlighted the quote by David Ramsey, and I was actually going to say, without having read the footnote, this is one specific way in which the United States of America is exceptional. And then I was going to distinguish between that exceptionalism, if you want to call it that, and exceptionalism as it's often understood, because prior to the American exceptionalism, which a certain type of it is something which we've seen in the 20th century, there was British exceptionalism. And I grew up as a British exceptionalist. You know, the British Empire gave peace to the world and civilization to the world. The Pax Britannica was the apex of human civilization. And even the British Israelites that started saying that the British were the 12th tribe of Israel and all that sort of stuff. It gets wackier and wackier. And so I have this aversion to one nation claiming that sort of exceptionalism, whether it be my own country, Britain, or my adoptive country as a US citizen, the United States. But this is absolutely true, that there was something about the founding of the United States, the Declaration of Independence and the rest of it, which is truly exceptional in human history. And in that sense, the word does stick, and justifiably.
And it fits well in this chapter in the sense that there's a paradox here. We're exceptional in that specific, very narrow sense, but the exception is that we restored something which had been around for 2,000 years and more. It wasn't like we invented something totally new ab ovo.
Right. And, Joseph, I think it's Paul Johnson in his History of the American People, and Paul Johnson, of course, is a British historian, but he says in the History of the American People that this exceptional thing about America in having created this government, which they had to do, as Reilly points out, once they separated from England formally, they had to now construct the government that they were now going to obey. And Johnson points out that because they were British subjects and because they were the heirs of this Judeo-Christian tradition as it had been lived out and developed in Britain, that, for example, English common law and the parliamentary system and these kinds of things, even though they predate England too, they developed in a certain way through English history that the founders benefited from. So I think they're, as long as we use this word in a guarded way and not in a jingoistic way and arrogant way, but just acknowledge that there is a patrimony that these men had inherited. And thank God they had, because that is the provenance of the ideas that are outlined in this book.
Yep.
This is like also the good steward who brings things old and new out of the treasure, because yes, there was a novus ordo seclorum in a sense. It was something new here, new order of the ages, but it was rooted in and a development of what had gone before. It was kind of the flowering of what went before. Another thought I had approaching this chapter was this. When we discuss books, oftentimes there'll be passages which are kind of obscure, and we ask each other, what do you think that meant? How do we interpret that? So far, there's been very little, if any, obscurity in this book. Robert Roddy writes with great clarity. He makes his thesis very distinct, and then he marshals his evidence in his quotes. But I did have a question on page 254 and 255 about the dates. He says at the bottom of page 254, he's introducing a quote of the Declaration of Cause and Necessity of Taking Up Arms issued by the Continental Congress on July 1775. So on page 255, there's this quote from a 1775 document. Then he says, exercising these absolute powers, Parliament then passed a series of 4 acts, together known as the Townshend Acts, 1767, which contained provisions for the collection of important duties. Again, without the consent of the colonies, who responded with another boycott of British goods. Parliament repealed the act in 1770. So I'm confused about the timing here. And maybe if you don't know the answer, we'll ask Robert that next week when we got him. And see
I don't know the answer to your question, but I will say this. We've been talking before about how the founders were resisting this notion of divine right of kings, this absolutism. And one might ask, well, in what way were the colonists under some kind of absolute rule? And Reilly does demonstrate how the entity in England that was starting to push the colonists around in a tyrannical way was actually Parliament. That these taxes that they were passing, and then the retribution that they were visiting on the colonies if there was any resistance, that is what that's the yoke that the founders were trying to throw off. And I thought it was helpful for him to outline that in this chapter so that you understand, well, how were they being pushed around tyrannically exactly. He gives that information. I thought it was helpful.
What I'm guessing, looking at this anomalous use of dates here, and I am only guessing, is that the passage quoted is from the Continental Congress in 1775, and what he's trying to show is it was things such as the Townsend Acts that pushed the colonists into making a declaration of that sort 8 years after the act and 5 years after its repeal. But it's just the way that it's worded doesn't make that clear. That would be my guess, as you say. Perhaps Robert Reilly can clarify for us next week.
All right. I want to read this quote from James Mason on page 257, but does anyone have something before that?
I'm the final page of the chapter before I have anything else highlighted.
Okay. Well, this is on page 257, about a third of the way down, from James Mason. This is before the General Court of Virginia. All acts of legislature apparently contrary to natural right and justice are, in our laws, and must be in the nature of things, considered as void. The laws of nature are the laws of God, whose authority can be superseded by no power on earth. A legislature must not obstruct our obedience to him from whose punishments they cannot protect us. All human constitutions which contradict God's laws, we are in conscience bound to disobey. He couldn't put it much more clearly than that.
Absolutely.
By the way,
yeah.
I don't know if I mentioned this before, but if I did, it's worth mentioning again. You've heard about the 1619 Project, right?
Oh, yeah. At the New York Times?
Yes. Well, I want to revive the real 1619 Project. In 1619, the Virginia legislature passed a law that every household had to plant at least 10 vines. That took place in 1619. That's the real origin of America.
They were civilized days, huh?
Well, Father, to your point, I thought it was really interesting, and I hope I'm not jumping ahead too much, but the 1619 Project and other things of this sort are trying to show that because the founding was protective of private property, and because private property, sadly, in this time meant for slaveholders, their slaves, that therefore this whole thing was set up just to protect the ownership of men by other men and so on. But often that there's a thinly veiled Marxist critique going on in these things that's attacking private property itself. And Reilly, I don't remember now where, he explains how the right of property is actually a very, very important thing. That that it's not just to be interpreted in a materialistic way or a greedy way, but that it actually is what empowers a man to be free and to exercise his freedom. And now I don't know where that is, but because you brought up the New York Times and this attack on the founding based on property rights, it's really an important thing to understand.
Vivian, my next passage is at the top of page 273, which I'm guessing is exactly what you're talking about.
Go ahead.
So at the top of page 273, this is Reilly.
Yes, this is it. Thank you.
Okay, that was my next highlighted passage. Great minds think alike, Vivian. So one of those rights, which it is the role of government to secure, is the right to property, so often thought to be simply a matter of economic efficiency, or worse, a spur to materialism. It is exactly the right to private property that insulates the individual from the caprices of state power and creates a protected legal and material space in which he can exercise his freedom. The right to private property stems directly from and is a requirement of the spiritual inviolability of the human person. Without this right, man is naked before the state. Without economic freedom, there is no political freedom. And one thing within that, as regards the 1619 Project, the spiritual inviolability of the human person. In other words, one thing we're not allowed to own is another human person.
Correct.
But the private property is crucial. And I also loved the footnote there, Cicero. So these principles go right back. So he says, the chief purpose in the establishment of states and constitutional orders was that individual property rights might be secured. For, as I said above, it is the peculiar function of state and city to guarantee to every man the free and undisturbed control of his own property. So here we have distributism, as Chesterton and Belloc would call it, enshrined not just in the American founding and in Robert Reilly's understanding of that, but also going back as far as Cicero himself.
But I have to disagree with Vivian in one important point. Vivian, you said that some of these movements today and the riots today are veiled Marxism. I don't think they're veiled at all.
Yeah, you're right. It's very, well, let's put it this way. If you go straight to, for example, the Black Lives Matter website, right, it's spelled out pretty clearly what they're all about. But I would say that still for a lot of people, amazingly so, they don't see Marxism when it's staring at them in the face.
Right. Yeah. Those are called blind people.
And yet, but first of all, that's true. But also, and this, even a more sad fact is that if people did see it staring them in the face, they wouldn't understand that there's anything wrong with Marxism because they are completely clueless about history.
Right. That's true too. That's true too. So I'm so glad, Joseph, that you found that quote. That's exactly what I was thinking of. And I just thought that was such a brilliant defense of private property, needed very much right now.
Right. And I've been thinking as I read these final three chapters that always being a contrarian, I'd like to go out and put up some more statues as I learn more about some of our founders and what they did and what they wrote. I mean, they deserve more statues.
Yeah. Yeah.
So shall we go to chapter 10?
Sure.
Yes, we should. This, by the way, is one of my favorite chapters because it's just, I love the title, The Antipodes, and literally they are poles apart, right? The American Revolution, the French Revolution. And I just love this quoting to their own damnation, the leaders of the French Revolution. I mean, this is horrific stuff. And having had 274 pages of what the American founders were basing their philosophy on, I mean, the difference is literally night and day, North Pole, South Pole.
Very, very stark. It's antipodal, no question about it.
Yeah.
It is striking. And unfortunately, many, many Americans learn in school that these were cut from the same cloth. And hence the confusion in trying to make these important distinctions. It's not easy to do.
Well, I learned somewhat later in my life of my French ancestry. Long story, but this woman gave me a book of our ancestors going back to 1500 actually. And I'm 1/4 French from the Vendée, and that made me proud.
You bet.
And you read what happened there.
Yeah, right. In fact, there's somewhere here that is a quote from the Butcher of the Vendée, page 279.
Yes.
4 lines down. French General Francois-Joseph Westermann, known as the Butcher of the Vendée, wrote to the Committee of Public Safety in Paris, "There is no more Vendée. According to the orders that you gave me, I crushed the children under the feet of the horses, massacred the women, who, at least for these, will not give birth to any more brigands. I do not have a prisoner to reproach me. I have exterminated all."
Yeah.
The book, our Vatican Secret Archives book,
yes,
from Rosa-Kahn that we just published, they have a whole section on the Vendée. And some of the historians now, with the honesty to look at this, are saying that in a way it was the first government orchestrated genocide in Europe, that it was precisely to literally exterminate every single person in that area of France.
The track record of secular fundamentalism as regards genocide is absolutely awful. And it was established here in the Vendée under the French Revolution, continued under the Soviet Revolution, continued under the Cultural Revolution by Chairman Mao in China. Marxists, all of these people, and yet, as you know, as we've been saying, this doesn't deter people from just resurrecting the monster in our own day.
What to me became a little bit clear in reading this chapter, been vague before in my mind, is that we think about the French Revolution as elevating reason, getting rid of superstition. It's logos. You know, he says that the American Revolution was a restoration based on reason. So what's the difference? Well, when you throw out God and you leave mere human reason, what do you have? Condorcet here, page 275 in the next page. He says, the perfectibility of man is truly limitless. This is simply a follow-up to Rousseau's yearning to change human nature. So it's reason, all right, but not reason tethered to existing nature that we have to realize is that our goal. It gives us what right and wrong is. It's reason untethered from nature, which then becomes...
Yeah, and it's not actually reason. It goes under the label of reason and rationalism, but it's really the human imagination run wild with a false anthropology to create nightmares. And again, really, ultimately, you have to judge these people and these ideas by the consequences. And it's not as if, you know, this is all a new thing and we're going to work it out as we go. We've had it now for 250 years, right? We know where these ideas lead, and these led to over and over and over again. And yet, here we go again.
Yes.
You know, the merry-go-round, here we go again.
Well, you know, the quote above that, or below that, Father, from de Tocqueville, also on page 276, he said that the men of the French Revolution, quote, had a robust faith in man's perfectibility and power. They had no doubt but that they were appointed to transform the human race. These sentiments and passions have become a sort of new religion. So now whenever people set themselves up in power as the new religion that's going to transform humanity, guess what? They have to get rid of the old religion, right? And the people in the Vendée, why were they massacred like this? Because they were resisting the destruction of the Catholic faith. And they were holding on to that, and that's why they were slaughtered.
And you have to get rid of the old man in order to establish the new man, which means that anybody who has antiquated ideas that doesn't fit in with the ideology has to be exterminated because they're actually something which is anti-progressive.
Well, there's an echo of this in so-called pre-Vatican II versus post-Vatican II church. If you want to have a transformation, you know, of the church, you've got to topple statues, you know, of anything that happened before 1962. I found it interesting. I guess I knew it before, but I was reminded of it that, you know, one of the key figures in the French Revolution was Marquis de Sade. Well, that tells you something, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and some of his statements are absolutely horrific. I mean, one of them is so sacrilegious that I wouldn't even want to read it, quite frankly. One thing I did like, you know, the Edmund Burke, the bottom of page 276 and top of page 277. Edmund Burke knew what this thinking foreshadowed. In the quote, in the groves of their academy, at the end of every vista, you see nothing but the gallows.
Yeah.
That's where it leads.
Yep.
The death of the innocent.
Yes, I had that underlined too. I thought that was such a pithy quote.
I got to underline it. You're right. Also, I like the quotes from Adams and Hamilton. I've become a great fan now of Adams. I know there's been some good books about him and movie and everything, but wow, he really had a clear mind and a not just clear and crystal and, you know, thin, but a rich, you know, traditional mind. Beautiful.
Yes.
283, actually, unless if you got that quote,
Go ahead.
that highlighted.
Go ahead. We can always move backwards.
283. Well, Adams wrote, quote, just as you and yours have become the dupes of your own atheism and profligacy, your nonsensical notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity, your philosophy, Condorcet, has waged a more cruel war against truth than was ever attempted by king or priest. I mean, says it all.
Yes.
No, we owe Bob Reilly a great debt of gratitude for having sifted through all the documents and pulled out these quotes, which they're not they're not cherry-picked quotes in the sense they don't represent the whole thought of an author, but they're kind of condensations, if you will, of an author's thought in a very, very clear and limpid way. Well, any more on the Antipodes?
No, I'm happy to go to the next chapter.
All right, then let's go to chapter 11. And on page 289, the first page of the chapter, he again has a quote which sums what he's doing. Were these rights, the rights established by our Constitution, ordered to any national end, or were they autonomous, to be exercised at the will and complete discretion of their possessor? In other words, was the enterprise primarily an exercise of pure will, or was it grounded in reason? So that's, again, it's a thread throughout this book. And he's critiquing Patrick Deneen and Michael Hanby because they are seeing the core value of the American founding to be the exaltation of the autonomous person, the autonomous will. And of course, Deneen seems to locate that, especially in Federalist 10 in Madison, and Bob Reilly shows him, well, Madison didn't really say that, you know.
Well, yeah, what I love, though, Father, on this page 289 is the great act of charity on the part of Robert Reilly,
Yes.
and I'm pleased to see it because, you know, we shouldn't demonize Patrick Deneen and Michael Hanby because they're right on most things, right? And I'm very pleased that Robert Reilly, you know, has nailed them on this, but they're right on most things. So this footnote here, despite my criticisms, I should make clear that I find the analysis of the current cultural decay penetrating and profound. They are very good at describing how bad things are, why they are bad, and to where they are leading. Both need to be read for an appreciation of the true precariousness of our situation. So I love it when an author who's basically clearly, you know, in dialogue against somebody actually prescribes you read them. You know, because, you know, basically saying they're wrong on this, but on everything else they're right. And I think we should bear that in mind. Otherwise, we're demonizing people that really don't warrant demonizing, you know?
Right. And he explains that the reason why he thinks they're mistaken about the founding is because they're misreading certain statements from certain documents written by Madison, such as the Federalist Papers or so on. In other words, he's not saying, you know, they're incorrect because they're bad or stupid or blind or anything like that. It's not an ad hominem kind of thing at all. And you're absolutely right, Joseph. It takes a real gentleman to show this kind of respect for his intellectual opposition. But I think Reilly...
A man who can argue without quarreling.
Yes. And I think he does an excellent job of showing very precisely where he thinks they have misconstrued certain statements without attacking them.
And I think he justifies his doing this at all by saying, look, we agree. I agree with Deneen and Hanby about the situation we're in. But are we simply going to accept it and live with it or try and change it? Well, what do you do to change it? If you think the Constitution is the problem, then you got to get another Constitution. If you think the Constitution is the solution, then you got to go back to the real Constitution. So, I mean, they may have perfect unanimity on how bad things are, but the solution they're proposing are really diametrically opposed.
And this is a radical difference in the literal sense of the word, you know, radix, the root, right? What's the root of the problem here? Is the root of the problem the Constitution? Or is actually the root of the solution the Constitution?
Yeah.
So it's a crucial book because it does actually ask that essential radical question about where we are in the United States today.
Right. It's a very good example he gives on 292 of William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist who believed that the U.S. Constitution was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. In other words, Garrison would agree with the New York Times 1619 Project, right? That it was the Constitution that somehow solidified the institution of slavery in the United States. And so what was Garrison's suggestion was to rip up the Constitution. In fact, he burned copies of it in his abolitionist rallies. And if Garrison were alive today, I would have to tell him, I absolutely agree with you that slavery is an evil institution, that one man must not own another man as a thing, as a piece of property. 100%. Just as I could agree with Hanby and Deneen on the problems in our current political situation. But as you said, Joseph, but what you see is the root cause. Here, Garrison's burning the Constitution, and Hanby, Deneen also, maybe they're not burning copies of it literally, but they're basically saying we have to start over.
Yeah, it's that the proverb, throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes.
Right? It's usually a mistake.
And
right?
even though I think Reilly does a good job of showing how Deneen mistranslates or misquotes and misunderstands whom here?
The Federalist 10.
Yeah. Nevertheless, the kind of American ethos that we grew up with and experienced is a rugged individualist, or each person on his own, and you have your own property, you have your own ideas, you have freedom of speech, freedom of association. So liberty is a very important part of the American ideal and idea. But the question is, how do you understand that liberty? Does liberty mean
yes,
whatever I feel like doing, that I can, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of meaning, as our famous federal judge said? Or is liberty rooted in the natural law, a world of ends, where to be free is to be able to choose what is good? And that's the key thing. And I think Wright does a great job in this book of teasing those things out. So we see there's really two ideas of liberty here, and they do get confused.
But if I can quote that great Irishman as regards the American founding, Oscar Wilde, and one of my favorite quotes from Oscar Wilde is in one of his poems where he describes liberty, the sort of liberty that the modern world understands, liberty as freedom's own Judas. No, the wrong sort of liberty is freedom's own Judas. It betrays freedom with a kiss. It's all about freedom, man, but the consequence is slavery.
That's right. And to your point, Father, about this, so what is this misinterpretation of Madison? When Madison writes the Federalist, and he's talking about, the factions that are bound to happen in a democratic society, and in order to prevent any one faction from being able to deprive rights to the minorities, right? And if a faction becomes too large, too powerful, it can mow down the rights of smaller groups and so on. And Madison was simply looking at this as a reality of public life. He wasn't saying that the purpose of the Constitution was to solidify this reality, but to accept it as a reality and make kind of contingencies to deal with it. And so the difference between, I love this line from Reilly, that blaming, factions and division and this kind of autonomous radical view of things on the Federalist is kind of like blaming adultery on marriage. Again, you have to have the right cause and effect. Just because Madison acknowledges this fact of life doesn't mean that's the reason for the Constitution. Anyway, I'm probably not doing a good job, but I think the quote from Reilly says it all. Trying to blame our problems on the Constitution is like trying to blame adultery on marriage.
I would say 314. We don't have. Obviously, we've been going for a while to read them, but there are two very good quotes. One by St. John Paul II and one by Benedict XVI, where both of them talk about America being exceptional in the good sense of the word, and referring to the Constitution and the natural law as what grounds the United States as something not just exceptional but good. In terms of the contemporary world and where we should be going.
Yes.
The only thing I would say, Father, whenever you're ready to conclude, I'll go on as long as you like, because I'm nothing better to do. But I would like, when we do get to the conclusion, prior to your final comments, to actually finish with the final paragraph of the whole book, because I do think it's very well written, and it's a good encapsulation and conclusion that Robert Reilly gives us in the final paragraph of the epilogue on page 331.
Oh, okay, the epilogue. Well, let's do that. Let's go to the epilogue and conclude here, because.
Okay, shall I read that paragraph and then
let me set the stage for it, okay, if I can, if I may, or if I can either. Also, the title of the epilogue is "If the Founding Was Good, Why Did Things Go Bad?" And he has a rather surprising answer. The short form answer is German historicism, especially the 19th century, how that affected our scholars, basically leading to a loss of natures, a loss of being things being what they are. And I never saw it that starkly, but he makes a pretty good point here. Maybe that's the point for the next book. So anything else you want to say on this epilogue?
There is actually, you're completely correct. There is a very good analysis and condemnation and critique of historicism, which is crucial for us to understand. It's just that, we've been going for 35 minutes. I just assumed we'd want to be thinking of concluding.
Well, let's conclude then. Before we conclude, though, so next week we'll have Robert Reilly.
Yes.
And do we have a book for the week following?
Yes, we do. We have, is it called The Next Pope?
Oh, The Next Pope by George Weigel. Okay.
And we're going to be discussing that for, I think it's 2 or 3 weeks. And then the author again, George Weigel, is going to be joining us for the final session. So, yes, if you haven't purchased it already, it's called The Next Pope. It's published by Ignatius Press, ignatius.com. Everything you should need to discover about the book should be there.
Very good. And, oh, yes, a reminder that Carl Olson, the editor of the Catholic World Report, hosted a symposium of 13 different scholars and writers on this book at catholicworldreport.com. Scroll down to the book section, you can see that. That might be helpful for you. So, Joseph, why don't you conclude the conclusion?
Yeah, so I think it's appropriate to finish our discussion of this book with the final paragraph of the final page of the epilogue by Robert Reilly himself.
Wait a second. Pause. I just want to say one thing from Dewey here. Who had a tremendous influence in education in America, right? I mean, he's the one. Page 325. 326. He says he claimed that man's nature is to have no nature, as human beings are, quote, nothing in themselves, close quote. I mean, that pretty much says it all.
And what does it also say about what that man really feels about the education of children?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Would you put your children in the hands of a person that believed that about what a person was?
Not at all.
All right. Do I have your permission to proceed now, Father?
Very good. Go ahead.
Okay. So Robert Reilly's final words at the end of the book, page 331, final paragraph of the epilogue. As grim as this all might seem, one should recognize that failure is written into the DNA of the modern project, because it cannot withstand the loss of the thing of which it is a distortion. Radical modernity is parasitic. It will fail to the extent to which it succeeds. It cannot survive its own erasure of natural law and Christianity. Paradoxically, the loss of faith in reason is a cause for hope. It proved the downfall of the Soviet Empire, which imploded from its own hollowness. The West's moral, social, and political implosion proceeds apace for similar reasons. Yet we can avoid that cataclysm any time we choose to, by returning to reality, to reason, to the laws of nature and of nature's God. Reality is resilient because, as Plato said, it is what is, not whatever one fancies. Logos wins in the end.
Amen. Hallelujah. Let's join each other together next week with the author of this book, Robert Reilly. Thanks for joining us at the Formed Book Club.